Welcome to the studio with Kristoff Malejczuk. In both Newtonian physics and quantum physics, we think of the universe as having 4 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. In terms of spatial dimensions, I am recording this episode yet again from my rented duplex in Boulder, Colorado. In terms of the temporal dimension, I am recording this 1 week late. I would like to explain, not make an excuse, but explain why this episode was retarded. My intent was to record it last Saturday. I got some of my personal tasks out of the way in the morning, but it took a bit more time than I expected. And then before I knew it, it was the evening, and there were these massive UFC fights going on, which of course I had to watch. There were 3 title fights. And before I knew it, it was midnight, and I hadn't recorded the episode. Well, really that's not so bad because the weekend has 2 days, and I could still record on Sunday, get the episode out on Monday. Wrong. I had made a commitment to go skiing with my friend Anna Dodson, who was visiting one of her close friends in Colorado. We were going to meet up at Keystone, one of the Coloradan ski resorts, and ski for the day. Now for me, skiing is a full day commitment because I need to wake up, leave the house around 6:30 or 7, get to the hill around 9, leave the hill around 4, get home around 6, unpack my ski equipment, get ready for the next day. The day is gone if I go skiing. It is midnight, the very beginning of Sunday morning, and the podcast is not yet recorded, and I don't have time to record after I'm back on Sunday. So I set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning. My intent was to record the podcast between 4:30 and 6:30, then leave the house at 7. Now I had a bit of trouble falling asleep, unfortunately. Probably got to fall asleep around 1:30 in the morning. That means that I had roughly 3 hours of sleep. But my alarm goes up, I make coffee, I'm excited for the episode. Typically what I do is I make a few bullet points, and then I talk for about half an hour or 40 minutes around those bullet points. So I had the bullet points already made, I sit down and I start recording, I'm excited, I'm ready to go. But I could simply not articulate sentences. It was so poor. It took me 3 tries to form the simplest of phrases, and the episode ended up being 39 minutes of unreleasable content. And that's why I'm late. And for that, dear listener, I sincerely apologize. After my failed attempt at recording episode 7 last Saturday, I then hopped into my car and drove 2 hours to get to Keystone, one of the big Coloradan ski resorts. Well, I wouldn't exactly classify this drive as having been safe. I was on 3 hours of sleep and 2 cups of coffee, and at some points I really just wanted to close my eyes when I was on the highway. Now I fought this urge. It probably didn't help that I was listening to a UC Berkeley University lecture on dissecting the Brothers Karamazov, the Dostoevsky novel. Probably not the most exciting content to keep me perked up and awake. Regardless, I ended up making it to the hill, no problem. Although that was definitely the most dangerous drive of my life, except for the numerous times that I have driven drunk. And when I say driving drunk, I mean completely sloshed, unable to walk. But then when I got behind the wheel of the car, smooth sailing. Now this is a joke, because I've never driven drunk or anything near it, and I don't suggest that you do. But I will say that when there are car crashes as a result of drinking and driving, typically the drunk driver lives because their body is in this nice, relaxed state. They're loose as a goose when the collision happens, and they survive. So drinking and driving potentially even less dangerous than my absolutely fatigued drive last Sunday. But all jokes aside, don't drink and drive. You're not in high school anymore. Do better. Smarten up. What I want to talk about today is a recent bookstore encounter that I had. Boulder is home to lots of wonderful independent businesses, small businesses that have a unique flair and character. The community of Boulder is quite proud of these establishments, and one of the independent establishments that really stands out is the Boulder Bookstore. The Boulder Bookstore has a lot of character. There are 3 stories, kind of hidden rooms that have books that are well organized by their different categories. They have all the latest releases that you would want to find, probably an abnormally large selection of hippie type books because, of course, it's Boulder. But they have philosophy, psychology, cookbooks, old European literature, Asian spiritual texts. You name it, they have it. Really, it's just a great bookstore. You could spend an afternoon there easily. It's wonderful. But I didn't go there just to browse. I went there with a purpose. Canadian academic Jordan Peterson had come out with his new book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, on March 2nd. And I, being a follower of Jordan Peterson's work and having read his preceding book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, a smash hit selling over 6 million copies internationally, thought that I would go and pick up the book and give it a read. Many of you listening are probably quite familiar with Jordan Peterson, but if you don't know who he is, he's a Canadian academic. Peterson received a PhD in clinical psychology from McGill in 1991. He stayed at McGill until 1993 as a postdoc, at which point he went to work at Harvard as both an assistant and then an associate professor until 1998. And since 1998, he has been a professor at the University of Toronto, although he is currently on leave. And throughout most of his career, he also worked as a clinical psychologist. Peterson is now probably best known as a public intellectual, and his rise to fame started in 2016, when he took a very outspoken and controversial stance on the Canadian federal government's Bill C-16. Peterson drew parallels between Bill C-16 and the restrictions put on free speech in Russia prior to and during the rise of the Soviet regime. His many critics argued that no, the bill was actually just put in place so that people, particularly trans people, could be referred to by non-standard pronouns and not have to suffer discrimination and hate. Regardless of how correct Peterson was in his stance, he nonetheless generated a lot of controversy, rose to prominence, but his 15 minutes of fame turned out to last much longer. And now it's 2021, 5 years later, and he is roughly as relevant as ever. And the reason for the sustained spotlight being turned on him is not certain inflammatory views that he has about corner issues, but is rather what Peterson has to say about topics such as meaning, good and evil, finding fulfillment in life, and adopting responsibility. All of these stemming from his actual research as a professor of psychology and his experience as a clinical psychologist. Peterson had been uploading his psychology lectures to YouTube for many years, and people found them to be compelling, cut them into smaller clips, and then would re-upload them to YouTube. And astonishingly, these clips of Peterson's psychology lectures have millions of views. And Peterson's ideas seem to appeal particularly to young people who are searching for meaning in their lives. And although what he talks about is equally applicable to both men and women, it seems as though young men gravitate disproportionately towards his message. It seems that what Peterson talks about is particularly salient in today's culture, where in the West we've grown up in a relatively godless society, whereas in the past God intrinsically provided meaning, but growing up in the absence of God means that there's not such a clear meaning or direction to life. Peterson attempts to fill this void by talking about the tremendous benefits of adopting responsibility, facing your problems head on, and attempting to become who you could be, living up to your potential. It's clear that Peterson is having a profound effect on millions of people, but I wanted to see how prominent he was as an actual scientist, as a professor of psychology, prior to his leap into the public sphere. Fortunately, that's very easy to do by consulting his H-index on Google Scholar. The H-index is a very common metric to use to evaluate both the quality and quantity of a scholar's output. So Peterson has an H-index of 55, which means that he has 55 papers, each having at least 55 citations. The H-index was invented by a physicist by the name of Jorge Hirsch, who was a professor at the University of California, San Diego. And in his paper that presented the H-index to the world, Hirsch also defined how to qualify the success of a scientist as a function of both their H-index and their number of years active as a scholar in their field. The first paper that Peterson co-authored was published in 1989. Now it's 2021, so that's 32 years of active scientific activity. And again, his H-index is 55. If you divide the H-index by the number of active years, you get the slope, so to speak, which in Peterson's case would be 1.72. In his paper, Hirsch says that a slope of 1 characterizes a successful scientist, and a slope of 2 characterizes outstanding scientists, likely to be found only at the top universities or major research laboratories. So Peterson being between those two means that, according to Hirsch, who invented the index, he's somewhere between successful and outstanding, and is a bit closer to the outstanding side. So his actual academic credentials seem to be pretty solid. I personally drew a lot of learning from Jordan Peterson in the 2017 to 2019 time window. His messages of adopting responsibility and of pursuing what is meaningful absolutely shaped my development into who I am today. In that time window, I was in my late teens, my early 20s. I'm actually still in my early 20s. And at that period of my life, I was just going through natural maturation and development. And I think listening to Jordan Peterson's ideas had a positive effect on my maturation and development. But I'm not here to talk about Jordan Peterson. That's just a tangent. Jordan Peterson is what got me to the bookstore. But what happened at the bookstore is even more interesting. I picked up Jordan Peterson's book, and then before purchasing it and leaving the establishment, I thought I would go and check out my favorite section, the philosophy section. At the Boulder Bookstore, the philosophy section is tucked away in this private back room. There's lots of natural light. Very few people are typically there. It's an apt place to have books on religion and philosophy. So as I was there in my safe space in the philosophy section, looking at their new acquisitions, a guy came around the corner and he starts to talk to me, and then he realizes that I wasn't an employee. That had been his original erroneous assumption. And then he apologizes, and I just say, "Oh, hey, no problem," and he walks away. So then I continue looking at the books, and I pulled out Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. It's a volume that I want to read. They seem to have a nice edition there, a nice translation. So I picked that up. I'm leaving the philosophy section, coincidentally at the same time as the guy who had approached me and who mistook me for an employee. So I say, "Hey, did you find what you were looking for?" He said, "Oh yeah, I actually did." And he was just looking for a notebook. Then he asked me, "Well, what were you getting?" And I show him that I had Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche. He said, "Oh man, I've read some Nietzsche." I'm thinking, "Oh, that's very cool. Not too many people have, or at least not in my peer group at any rate." And we end up getting into this half-hour conversation. We're talking a bit about Nietzsche. I'm talking about some of the largest takeaways for me, which had concerned morality. I'll probably talk about that more in depth in another episode. I found reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra to have a lasting impact. Throughout our conversation, we talked about various things ranging from Western philosophy to Eastern philosophy to drugs to development of the spirit and self-improvement. He noticed that I had the Peterson book. He thought that was neat. He also had consumed a fair amount of Peterson content. So this guy and I, his name's Cam. Cam and I had this half-hour conversation, and we even exchanged numbers, and I'm probably going to hang out with him next weekend. He's an interesting guy. That type of encounter doesn't happen very often. When you run into someone in public, you end up having something in common, then you end up having a conversation and then exchange contact information with the intent of exchanging ideas together in the future. The most similar thing to this that has happened to me was an experience that I had in Whole Foods back in September. I had just arrived in Boulder. I'd been in Boulder for under 2 weeks at this point. And I was at Whole Foods, which is my grocery store of choice in Boulder. The Boulder Whole Foods once a week would have this guy who would cook products as samples and give them to the customers. And his name was William, but he went by the name Will Yum, as in Y-U-M. It was a nice play on words. He was a very jovial guy, and he had served me some of the food that they were giving away to patrons. I'm continuing to shop, and then he runs into me in one of the aisles, and he says, "Hey, bro, do you take supplements?" I said, well, yes, I do. Because I take some supplements. Nothing crazy, just some standard stuff, maybe a bit of turmeric, some zinc, some vitamin D. Oh, yeah, especially in the time of COVID, if you're not taking vitamin D and zinc, what are you doing? Not to mention vitamin C. Regardless, I said, yes, I take supplements. He says, well, that's so cool, man, because we have this big sale going on. It's 40% off, or some large percentage off. And he points me to the supplements aisle. So I go there. Oh, also, I made this guy sound like a total bro, and that was absolutely the way he was talking, but he's a 40-year-old with an enormous belly. Super kind, but definitely not the type of guy that you would think takes supplements. Regardless, I go to the supplements aisle, I'm looking, and I see some mushroom supplements there. They have some reishi, some lion's mane, some cordyceps. And I've taken some lion's mane in the past. I've done a bunch of research about different types of mushroom supplements, and I take a couple bottles of the reishi. I'm continuing down the supplements aisle. I'm checking out what else they have. I mean, it's a really big sale. And then I'm passing another man who's in the aisle. And I pass him, I just say, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" Just a polite greeting. And he responds to my casual greeting, saying, "Oh, like, good, how are you?" So I said, "Oh, not bad. I'm getting some supplements." And I decided to ask him, I don't know why, I just asked him, "What are you getting?" And then he tells me he's getting some mushroom supplements and that he is super into mushrooms. And this guy, he's probably around 50, he's balding, he's very nice. Not exactly someone in my age range, nor someone whom I expected to share my interests. Well, he says that he's picking up some mushroom supplements. I thought that was neat, so I asked him a bit about that, and I said, well, I was actually thinking of growing some mushrooms. And he said, "No way, man. Me too." I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." So we talk a bit more about mushrooms, and he suggests that we exchange contact information. And I think that's not a bad idea at all, because he had mentioned that he had a buddy in Denver who was a super experienced mushroom cultivator, and I thought I could get some tips from this guy and that other guy. Now, this whole time, we had been talking about mushroom supplements, mushrooms for health. And my intent when I said that I had been interested in growing mushrooms is I had briefly looked into growing psilocybin, which for those of you who don't know would be magic mushrooms. Now, this guy got my number, probably thinking I wanted to grow some lion's mane, some cordyceps, something that would help a bit with either brain function or physical recovery, maybe focus, whatever. And I didn't want us to not be on the same page. So I ask him, by the way, what type of mushrooms are you thinking of growing? He looks around a bit. He says, psilocybin. He's like, what about you? I'm like, oh yeah, me too, man. So now we're totally on the same page. And then he divulges that his buddy in Denver is one of the largest growers of psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. So he runs a business that is mass growing psilocybin. So we exchange numbers. The guy sends me a link to an article. I didn't have time to read the article, and now I actually haven't responded to him. So the last correspondence I have with this mushroom man that I met in Whole Foods is a text that he sent me on September 12th with a link to an article that I haven't yet read. So I feel quite poorly about being the sole person to blame for the collapse of that interaction. Regardless, I did learn later through a bit more research that although psilocybin is decriminalized in Denver, such is not the case in Boulder, and some of the laws are pretty janky and include jail time as well as very large fines for even growing the substance. So I have decided to not grow psilocybin, probably just not worth the risk. That's the only other example I can think of where I've interacted with a stranger in a public place, where the expectation was that our exchange would amount to nothing more than a bit of cursory small talk, but at the end, the interaction led to the discovery of shared interests and the exchange of contact information with the intent of communicating with each other in the future. So for Chris, the guy I met in Whole Foods, it was quite clear why we exchanged information. We both had an interest in growing mushrooms. And as we found out later, probably also a mutual interest in exploring the bounds of consciousness and the nature of the mind. And I was thinking about the bookstore encounter and what made me want to stay in touch with that guy. And I realized that it was his high level of interest in abstract ideas. We talked a lot about very abstract concepts, and I found that to be very enjoyable. And then I thought, well, what are the traits that my closest friends have in common? And for the most part, they are both high in intelligence and have high interest in exploring abstract ideas. Now, they also have other traits, of course. In general, they are generous and open-minded and open to experience. But the two factors that stuck out to me highly were intelligence and interest in abstract ideas. As a Silicon Valley engineer, I am around a lot of very intelligent individuals, but not all of them are interested in abstractions. Engineers, of course, are very interested in objective reality, but subjective reality and experience and ideas that cannot be concretized or quantified are often not of great interest to many engineers. So in my day job, despite being surrounded by people who are highly intelligent, it doesn't always come along with an interest in that which cannot be easily quantified. Now, I have a few friends who are quite high in intelligence, but don't have a big interest in abstract ideas. And these people are typically older. I guess there's also an appeal in people who are older because they have different perspectives, more life experience. And then I also have friends who are somewhat intelligent, but have high interest in abstract ideas. And that can be interesting and fun as well. And then finally, I have some other friends who are somewhat intelligent and have moderate interest in abstract ideas. And the friendship pends largely on shared interests. But remove those interests and there's not a whole lot beneath the surface. But that struck me, really. My closest friends tend to exhibit high intelligence and high interest in abstract ideas. So let's put aside the interest in abstract ideas, but focus in on intelligence. That means that I actively discriminate when choosing who my friends are based on their intelligence. Now, it also happens that life tends to discriminate based on intelligence, at least in the West. If you're more intelligent, you're more likely to get a higher status job and to have a more successful career. The two traits that best predict workplace success are intelligence and conscientiousness. Conscientiousness being one of the 5 bases of personality, and that is more or less synonymous with hardworkingness. So intelligence is something that you cannot control, yet it has such a large impact on your life. If you don't have high intelligence, you can't go to university, you can't get a high-skilled job, you can't necessarily go to college. You might not even be intelligent enough to learn a trade, and none of that would be your fault, yet it will totally alter the course of your life. There's a lot of talk nowadays about equalizing society along racial lines. Now, of course, there are large differences in economic privilege that people have, and these lines of privilege tend to also correlate with race, particularly in the United States. Now, regardless of whether you thought the Black Lives Matter movement was this wonderful movement for social justice and liberation, or whether you thought it was a Marxist plan to bring down the West, it doesn't matter. If you are a resident of the United States, it is absolutely in your best interest to have the smallest amount of wealth inequality possible, because wealth inequality leads to unrest. What's very neat is that absolute poverty doesn't lead to a dysfunctional, terrible society. But what does lead to a terrible, dysfunctional society is extremely high levels of relative wealth inequality, of relative poverty. Absolute poverty, not a huge issue. Your neighbor's poor, you're poor, everyone's poor, everyone's happy. But suddenly, you get some rich people in there, and there become these tensions, and this resentment begins to form. And regardless of whether the cause of the poverty of the black population in the US is due to race, or whether it's just a correlation, it doesn't matter. It's not good to have a particular group of people at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, because it creates this very terrible us versus them mentality, and you want to have a society in which everyone feels that they are equally included and have equal opportunity. When discussing wealth inequality, something that I think is at least as important to discuss as race is intelligence. So let's say that you're able to remove all racists and bigots from society, you manage to pour money into the communities of the underprivileged, and you end up after decades and decades with a society that has this beautiful racial wealth equality. Problem solved, right? Now you have total wealth equality. Well, that's not quite right. Intelligence is the elephant in the room. What isn't going away is the wealth gap that exists as a result of varying intelligences. The highest paying jobs are the highest skilled jobs, and the highest skilled jobs demand the highest amount of intelligence. And although intelligence certainly impacts your lot in life right now, I think it's going to become an even starker factor within the next 5, 10, 20 years. In particular, with the rise of automation and artificial intelligence. Automation, AI, the first jobs they're going to replace are going to be the ones that require the least amount of skill. The jobs that require the least amount of skill are occupied by those with the lowest levels of intelligence. So suddenly we get some increases in the adoption of automation. Yes, you need certain people to supervise the automation processes, but a large portion of the jobs are cut out. And that means that you're left with a lot of unintelligent people who don't have jobs. And that's very concerning, because without a job, you don't have responsibility, and without responsibility, you don't have meaning. And that actually ties in very nicely with Jordan Peterson. That's absolutely something that Jordan Peterson would say. So whereas I am no economist and I come bearing no solutions for any problem of wealth inequality, I would like to bring forth this conversation, the thought of how intelligence impacts your position in the socioeconomic hierarchy, and to maybe get others to begin to think about this, because it's certainly not at the forefront of any conversations that I'm hearing. And the advancement of technology is going to do nothing but exacerbate this already existing gap. So when I look at my friend group, what I don't see is racial homogeneity, but I do see some intelligence homogeneity. And people pick their intelligence just as much as they pick their race. If you are proud of how smart you are extraordinarily misled. You had nothing to do with how intelligent you are. You are extremely fortunate and nothing more. And if you want to give credit to yourself because you think you're smart and hardworking, let's say you think the intelligence could be attributed to luck, but your hardworkingness can be attributed to yourself, I think that's extremely misguided. Your ability to work hard and your choice to work hard boils down just as much to luck as your intelligence does. If you're pleased with where you are in the socioeconomic hierarchy, you shouldn't be proud of yourself. You should be grateful for having extreme luck. Now, of course, yes, you should experience some positive emotion because positive emotion is one, not only great to feel, but two is positive feedback that will enable you to continue your habits that led you to your current position, and hopefully you'll be able to continue to ascend and lead a more fulfilling and meaningful life. So yes, you should absolutely be experiencing positive emotion for where you are in your life, if you are in a place that you're content with, or if you're heading in the right direction. But that positive emotion shouldn't manifest itself as pride. It should manifest itself as being grateful. I think the same can be said for nationality, right? Being too proud of your country is not a great thing. You were just lucky enough to be born there. So you can be extremely grateful for being born into a country which has an excess of wealth and opportunity, such as for me being born in Canada. I'm tremendously grateful. My life would be so different if I had been born in Syria. God, I could hardly think of anywhere less desirable to be born. In Syria, much of the Middle East, and much of Africa, I think, are places that are, for many, many, many people, devoid of opportunity and hope, and are war-torn and ravaged and corrupt. So I'm incredibly grateful to have been born in Canada. But I don't want to be too proud of it. I had nothing to do with it. Pride is just going to serve to blind me to potential fallbacks and errors that the country would commit. I don't want pride to blind me to the truth. If I have a grateful attitude rather than a proud attitude, I think it obscures the truth less and allows me to perceive both the positive and the negative through a more objective lens. Anyway, all that to say, in the same way that it makes hardly any sense to be proud of your country, you had no say in you being born there, it also makes equally little sense for you to be proud of your intelligence. And your intelligence plays a huge role in where you end up in life. The final rule of Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order, is titled, "Be Grateful in Spite of Your Suffering." And while I haven't yet read that chapter, I think it's a tremendous message, regardless of where you are on the socioeconomic hierarchy. If you're at the top, be grateful, don't be proud, and acknowledge the role that luck played, and be grateful that you got a nice roll of the dice. And if you're near the bottom, be grateful for what you have, even if you don't have much, because being grateful is far better than the alternative of resentment. aim towards love. So I guess all I'm trying to say is be grateful. And I am very grateful that you took the time to listen to The Studio with Kristoff Malejczuk. You can follow me on Instagram at Malejczuk. That's my last name, at MALEJCZUK. I post content there regularly, particularly to my Instagram story. I think it's entertaining. Follow me on Clubhouse. Tell your friends about this podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Leave me a rating. Leave me a review. Follow me on Spotify. Tell your friends. Tell your family. And until next time, this is The Studio with Kristoff Malejczuk.